Imagine you could vote for the greatest battle your country ever fought. Not the most famous, not the most studied, the greatest by any measure you care to name. The scale of the forces, the ferocity of the fighting, the strategic consequences, the cost in human lives. Now imagine that when the votes were counted, the winner was a battle you had never heard of. A battle fought in a jungle on the other side of the world by an army your country had quietly decided to forget. That is exactly what happened in Britain in 2013, when the National Army Museum asked the public to nominate the greatest battle in British military history. Not Blenheim, not Waterloo, not El Alamein. The winner was a pair of small towns in the jungles of northeast India that most British schoolchildren cannot locate on a map. Before I tell you what happened there, I want to ask you something. Think carefully. Can you name the general who led what became, by 1945, the largest army in the world? Do you know what became of him? Because Britain did not for a very long time. Stay with me until the end. What you are about to discover will change the way you understand the Second World War. In May of 1945, London erupted. Victory in Europe had been declared, and for the first time in 6 years, the city lit up its lights and filled its streets with a joy that was close to delirium. Crowds gathered at Buckingham Palace. Churchill appeared on a balcony. Church bells rang from one end of the country to the other. The war, as far as most of Britain was concerned, was over. 6,000 miles away, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the 14th Army was still fighting and still dying. Still 3 months from the end. This is where the story of the Forgotten Army truly begins. Not in the jungle, but in the gap between the jungle and the celebration. Not in the battle itself, but in the silence that surrounded it. The men who had fought the longest continuous land campaign in British military history came home to a country that had already folded the map and put it away. The arithmetic of the forgetting was not complicated. 30,000 British servicemen died fighting Japan, compared to 235,000 in the war against Germany. Those numbers drove attention westward, and it never came back. The phrase did not come from historians retrospectively as a gentle lament. It was delivered to the soldiers themselves directly, before they had even finished fighting, as a piece of blunt, administrative honesty. The words were something to this effect. When you go home, do not worry about what to tell your friends and loved ones about your service in Asia. No one will know where you were, or where it is, if you do. You are, and will remain, the Forgotten Army. What those men had accomplished was beyond almost any military achievement in British history. In a public vote 8 decades later, their battle would be declared the greatest Britain ever fought. Their general would be ranked alongside Wellington. The enemy they defeated would judge the defeat the worst in their entire military history. And yet the victory was buried, the men were scattered, and the country moved on. To understand how something so enormous could be so completely forgotten, you must first understand the scale of the shame that preceded it. You must go back to the catastrophe at the beginning. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese aircraft destroyed most of the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Within hours, Japan had declared war on Britain and the United States. What followed, for the British Empire in Asia, was a collapse so swift and so total that it defies easy comprehension even today. Hong Kong fell in December. Malaya fell in January. Singapore fell in February of 1942. 100,000 Allied troops surrendered to a Japanese force, a fraction of their size. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. 100,000 men, gone, without the fight that the scale of the force should have been capable of mounting. The shock ran through the entire British military establishment like a fracture through glass, invisible from a distance and catastrophic under pressure. Burma followed. The Japanese pushed north through dense jungle at a pace the British could not match. The defending forces fell back, and back, and back, 900 miles before it ended at the Indian border. It was the longest fighting withdrawal in the history of British arms, conducted in conditions that stripped men to almost nothing. One officer who watched the survivors stagger across the frontier into India in May of 1942 described them as gaunt and tattered, most without boots, many reduced to their underwear, almost without guns. He said they looked like scarecrows, but they looked like soldiers too. That officer was Lieutenant General William Slim, and he had just led what remained of Burma Corps out of disaster. His command had lost 13,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. Of the 150 field guns they had crossed into Burma with, 28 came out. He stood on the Imphal plain in the hills of northeast India and watched a defeated army file past him, and he asked himself the question that would define the next 3 years of his life. Not how had this happened, but how was it going to be reversed? Slim was not the kind of figure British military tradition tended to produce in its senior officers. A tradesman's son from Birmingham, educated on a scholarship, who had worked as a teacher and then as a clerk before the First World War, gave him his opening. He had served at Gallipoli, where he was wounded. He had won the Military Cross in Mesopotamia. Between the wars, he had risen slowly through the ranks of the Indian Army, an institution most of the British establishment regarded as a posting for those who had not quite made the cut elsewhere. He was not glamorous. He was not well connected. He was not the product of the networks that produced most British generals of his era. What he was, as it turned out, was the finest military commander Britain fielded in the entire war. Slim understood what the men who had led the retreat into India did not. The Japanese had not beaten the British because they were superior soldiers. They had beaten them because they had a superior method, and that method exploited a single catastrophic flaw in British doctrine. Every time the Japanese cut the supply lines of a British unit, that unit retreated. The Japanese used this predictability like a weapon. Infiltrate behind the enemy, cut the road, wait for the retreat to begin, then strike the column from behind. It had worked in Malaya. It had worked in Burma. Against a properly prepared force, it was completely reversible. The Japanese tactic depended entirely on one assumption, that the British would run. Slim decided they would not. His army was also killing itself with disease faster than the Japanese were killing it with bullets. For every soldier evacuated for wounds, 120 were evacuated sick. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid. The force was dissolving in the jungle without a shot being fired. Slim made the remedy brutally simple. Commanders whose units fell below 95% compliance with the daily anti-malarial medication were sacked, not warned, sacked. The evacuation rate for sickness dropped in direct proportion to the rise in compliance. In November of 1943, the 14th Army was formally constituted under Slim's command, a force unlike anything the British military had assembled before. British conscripts and career soldiers alongside Indian units from a dozen ethnic and religious communities. Gurkhas from the mountains of Nepal, soldiers from East and West Africa, men who had been beaten and men who had never been tested, speaking perhaps 30 languages between them, united for the moment by the fact that all of them had come to the same mountainous frontier for the same purpose. His task was to make them coherent before the Japanese gave him the chance to find out whether he had managed it. Before Mutaguchi gave him that chance, a smaller one presented itself. In February of 1944, a Japanese attack in the coastal Arakan region produced exactly the situation Slim had prepared for. A British headquarters was overrun, units were cut off, and every previous British instinct said retreat immediately. On Slim's orders, the surrounded forces formed defensive boxes, called in air supply, and held. The Japanese assault broke itself against positions that refused to move. 5,335 Japanese died in the fighting. The new doctrine had its proof of concept, and when Slim needed battle-hardened troops to reinforce the next crisis, the men who had just survived the admin box were the first he called. That next crisis was being planned at that precise moment in the headquarters of the Japanese 15th Army by a man who had convinced himself he was about to conquer India. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi had been present at the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, which triggered the full-scale Japanese invasion of China. He had commanded the 18th Division in the conquest of Malaya. He had watched the great British defeats of 1941 and 1942 and drawn from them a conclusion that would prove catastrophically wrong, that the British soldier was fundamentally incapable of standing and fighting. From the moment he assumed command of the 15th Army in 1943, he had been drafting the plan that would end British rule in Asia. The plan was codenamed Operation U-Go. 3 divisions, 85,000 men, would cross the Chindwin River in March of 1944, push through the mountainous frontier between Burma and India, and seize 2 British administrative centers, Imphal and Kohima. With these supply bases captured, the British position in northeast India would be untenable. Then, Mutaguchi believed, the road to Delhi lay open, the road to the end of the empire itself. The ambition was amplified by a political dimension that Mutaguchi had embraced without examining closely enough. Subhas Chandra Bose, the Indian nationalist leader who had allied himself with Japan, had persuaded significant elements of the Japanese command that a Japanese advance into India would trigger a nationwide uprising against British rule. The Indian soldiers of the 14th Army would mutiny, Bose promised, and murder their British officers the moment Japanese forces appeared on Indian soil. His Indian National Army, formed from prisoners of war and defectors, would march alongside the Japanese as liberators. It was a breathtaking vision of colonial collapse, and Mutaguchi had adopted it as a strategic assumption. His own officers were more skeptical. His divisional commanders believed he was gambling too heavily on capturing Imphal quickly before his supply lines collapsed. His planning staff had the same concerns. The Japanese Army's own logistics expert, General Obata Nobuyoshi, reviewed the plan and called it Bakamono, a fool's enterprise. He was dismissed. The entire offensive rested on a single calculation. The campaign would last 3 weeks. The troops would carry 3 weeks of supplies. They would seize British depots at Imphal and use the enemy's stores to sustain their advance. The plan contained no serious provision for what would happen if Imphal did not fall on schedule. Mutaguchi was certain it would. Not every Japanese general shared the certainty. Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, the commander of the 31st Division, tasked with capturing Kohima and cutting the road north of Imphal, was a hard-bitten combat veteran who had been on the opposing side of the factional war that ran through the Japanese officer corps like a wound that never healed. He and Mutaguchi distrusted each other at a level that went well beyond professional tension. Before leading his men across the border, Sato gathered his officers and told them plainly, "I will take this opportunity, gentlemen, of making something quite clear to you. Miracles apart, every one of us is likely to lose his life in this operation." He said it not as a warning, he said it as a forecast. On the 8th of March, 1944, the largest Japanese military offensive since the fall of Singapore crossed the Chindwin River and moved toward the Indian frontier through terrain so difficult that some columns took days to cover distances. A glance at a map suggested could be covered in hours. The clock had been running from the moment the first man crossed the river. The ground they were moving toward was not well known to the outside world, and would not be until long after most of the men who defended it were dead. Imphal was the capital of the Indian state of Manipur, a town sitting on a plain ringed by mountains and dense jungle, the administrative and logistical hub of the entire Northeast India Command. Lieutenant General Jeffrey Scoons had 4 Indian divisions there, with everything the Army needed to sustain a long campaign: food, fuel, ammunition, the supply depots that Mutaguchi had been counting on since he first put pen to paper. 60 miles north of Imphal, the road climbed through the Naga Hills and arrived at the second objective, Kohima, a small administrative town on a ridge barely a mile long and a few hundred yards wide, sitting at altitude in the mountains where the road connecting Imphal to the main British railhead at Dimapur ran along the hillside. Whoever held this ridge held the road. Whoever held the road decided whether Imphal survived or starved. In terms of military geography, Kohima was the lock on a door that could not be unlocked from the other side. The deputy commissioner of the Naga Hills, a man named Charles Pawsey, had lived here for 20 years. He knew the Naga people, the tribal communities of the surrounding hills, with the particular intimacy of a British official who had chosen to stay long enough to learn. His bungalow sat on the hillside at a bend in the road, with terraced gardens descending below it, and cut into the lowest terrace a tennis court. In the weeks before the Japanese arrived, Naga villagers began bringing intelligence: where the enemy was moving, which paths they were using, how many men in each column. The Naga people had their own reasons to resist the Japanese, reasons rooted in the history of their hills and the nature of what Japanese occupation had meant elsewhere, and they acted on those reasons with a quiet effectiveness that almost certainly saved the garrison's life. They carried ammunition across jungle tracks that British mules could not navigate. They guided patrols. They sheltered wounded men. In a colonial war fought partly over the question of who owned India, the indigenous people of these hills chose their side, and they chose it with open eyes. The garrison that depended on Naga loyalty numbered 2,500 men, a significant proportion of them non-combatants, support staff, supply clerks, administrators who had been handed rifles and told to stand in a trench. The core fighting strength was built around a single battalion, the 4th Battalion, the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment. The commander was Colonel Hugh Richards, a former Chindit officer who possessed the particular skills the situation required, the ability to organize a defense out of whatever happened to be lying around, and the psychological fortitude to do it without ever suggesting to the men under him that the odds were anything other than manageable. They were not manageable. They were a catastrophe in preparation. Slim would later admit, in writing, with a candor almost unprecedented among senior officers of any nation, that he had made a serious error. He had predicted the Japanese would send no more than a regiment against Kohima, perhaps 3,000 men, to cut the road. He had not anticipated Mutaguchi would commit an entire division, 15,000 soldiers, a 6-to-1 advantage over every man the garrison could field. The relief force, the British 2nd Division, dispatched the moment the scale of the threat became clear, was racing from Dimapur, 40 miles away through difficult ground, with no guarantee of arriving before the ridge fell. On the 3rd of April, 1944, the advance elements of Sato's division reached the outskirts of Kohima. 2 days later, the encirclement was complete. The garrison was cut off. The road was closed. What happened on that ridge over the following 2 weeks was voted, 69 years later, the greatest battle in British military history. The water supply went on day 1. The Japanese captured the southern spur of the position, and with it, the water point that served the entire garrison. From that morning, every drop had to come from a small spring on the north slope of Garrison Hill, reachable only after dark, under fire from snipers who had worked out precisely why men kept going there at night. The medical station had no cover. There was nowhere to position it outside the direct line of sight from Japanese positions, and nowhere to shelter it from the mortars that began arriving within hours of the encirclement being sealed. The wounded were treated in a long trench with overhead cover, too thin to stop a shell. Patients could look up from their stretchers and watch Japanese mortar crews across the ridge loading the weapons that had already hit some of them and might hit them again before their wounds were dressed. Stretcher bearers moved through bullet-swept ground to bring men in from forward positions. Some of the casualties were struck a second time while being carried back. The perimeter shrank. Night after night, the Japanese probed forward. The shallow defensive line contracted toward Garrison Hill as positions on the outlying spurs were abandoned to concentrate strength at the center. By the end of a fortnight, the entire defense had been compressed into a shell-pocked area, 350 meters square. Within that space, 2,500 men, the medical trench, the reserve ammunition, and the artillery observation post that was the garrison's only link to the guns 2 miles to the west. 25 separate Japanese attacks in 14 days, many at night, announced by screaming and bugle calls and the sound of men moving fast through undergrowth toward a line held by men who had not slept properly in days. British soldiers held their fire until the attackers were 15 yards away, sometimes closer, then cut the charging waves down at ranges where accuracy was irrelevant. Any enemy soldier who made it into a British trench was killed with a bayonet or a rifle butt or whatever else was available. One Bren gunner, knocked unconscious during a night assault, came round to find a Japanese officer crouching beside him in the dark. He killed the man with his hands and went back to his gun. At the north end of the ridge, in the gardens below the deputy commissioner's bungalow, the fighting had narrowed to its most particular and terrible geometry. The tennis court, an asphalt rectangle cut into the slope, perhaps 20 meters wide. The Japanese had worked their way into positions along the upper edge. The West Kents held the lower. The distance between them was the width of the court, perhaps 15 meters of open surface that neither side could cross in daylight without dying. And so they stayed, two armies in their respective trenches, separated by an asphalt rectangle, while the world contracted around them. When rifle ammunition ran short, the men rolled grenades at each other. A grenade cannot be thrown with precision at 15 meters in darkness, but it can be rolled, back and forth across the asphalt, night after night. Soldiers later described it as resembling, in its peculiar rhythm, a snowball fight, except that each throw was potentially lethal and each duck was necessary. One British officer constructed a simple wooden barrier, V-shaped, knocked together from salvaged timber, placed in front of foxholes at night to deflect incoming grenades away from the trench. The Japanese never realized what their opponents were doing. British soldiers learned, purely by sound, to distinguish whether their grenades had exploded on the surface of the court or inside a Japanese position. The surface meant a miss. The other sound meant something quite different. On the morning of the 8th of April, Lance Corporal John Pennington Harmon woke on the hill adjacent to the court to find the Japanese had placed a machine gun post in a bunker between two British company positions overnight. The position was within 50 yards of his own trench. Its field of fire made movement across the hill nearly impossible. His company commander, Major Donald Easton, was discussing with the sergeant major how to deal with it when Harmon stood up without a word and walked toward the bunker. He was 29 years old, the son of a millionaire businessman who owned Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel. He had been educated at B. Dales and Clifton College. He had told his company commander some weeks before that he believed he could not be killed in this war, a conviction apparently based on prophecies made by fortune tellers. He had already done inexplicable things, slipping out of the position at night on private reconnaissance, returning on one occasion with rice he had taken from a Japanese store he had located alone in the dark. The men who served with him had simply accepted that Harmon operated at a different frequency of relationship with danger than normal calculation could reach. He got under the line of fire from the bunker, close enough to act. He pulled the pin from a grenade, counted to 2 after releasing the lever, holding it far longer than standard practice to ensure it detonated immediately on entry, and pushed it through the slit of the bunker. He dived in after it went off. He came out carrying a Japanese machine gun. "There are 2 dead Japanese in there," he said. Easter Sunday, the 9th of April. Harmon ordered covering fire from his Bren gun team, took his Lee Enfield rifle with fixed bayonet, and went out alone. He charged a group of Japanese soldiers who were digging in. He shot 4 of them. He bayoneted 1. He turned to walk back to the British lines. A burst of machine gun fire caught him in the side. Major Easton crawled out under fire and brought him in. Harmon was alive when Easton reached him. He was dying when Easton carried him back to the trench. "Don't bother, sir," he said. "I got the lot." He died in his commander's arms. The Victoria Cross was awarded posthumously. His father collected it from Buckingham Palace and carried it in his pocket for the rest of his life. Harmon was one of 2 Victoria Crosses awarded at Kohima. The 4th Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment held that ridge for 15 full days against an enemy that outnumbered them 6-1. They bought 2 British divisions the time needed to force their way up the road from Dimapur. The relief came on the 18th of April. The leading elements of the British 2nd Division, having fought through Japanese roadblocks on the Dimapur Road, reached Garrison Hill. What they found was 350 meters of shattered ground, the dead of both sides still unburied in sectors where recovery had been impossible. Men who had not slept a full night in a fortnight. A medical trench full of wounded who had been watching enemy positions since day one, and a tennis court with trenches occupied on both sides of the net. The siege of Kohima was broken. The battle for Kohima had barely begun. While the West Kents had held the ridge, 60 miles to the south, the larger and longer drama of Imphal had been unfolding at a different pace and on a different scale. The Japanese had encircled the Imphal plain by early April, cutting the road that was its only supply artery and isolating Skoon's 4 divisions inside a perimeter that now depended entirely on what fell from the sky. From the day the road closed, the Royal Air Force flew in provisions on a scale that had never been attempted under operational conditions. Nearly 19,000 tons of supplies reached the garrison by air. 12,000 men were flown in as reinforcements. 13,000 wounded were evacuated outward. When the 5th Indian Division was needed to reinforce the plain, the entire division was airlifted from the Arakan front in 48 hours. Men who had been in combat in one jungle that morning were in a different jungle by nightfall, ready to fight again. It was the largest movement of troops by air yet attempted in the history of warfare. When the Royal Air Force announced it would need to redeploy its transport aircraft to the Middle East, Mountbatten refused. Churchill backed him directly. Those aircraft stayed, and their staying was worth more to the battle than a fresh division on the ground, because they did not merely keep the garrison alive. They demolished the foundational assumption on which Mutaguchi had staked his entire offensive. He had sent his men in with 3 weeks of supplies because they were going to capture British stores at Imphal and live off the enemy's food. The British stores were being replenished from the air. The Japanese had no air supply. 85,000 men were in the field, on shrinking rations, in terrain that the monsoon was turning to mud, and the supply depots that were supposed to feed them had not fallen and were not going to fall. Every day the Japanese stayed in the jungle, they were weaker than the day before. Every day the garrison held its perimeter, it was stronger. Imphal saw savage fighting from April through June. The Shenam Saddle, a ridge of hills south of the plain overlooking the only all-weather airfield in Allied hands, changed hands multiple times in close-quarters assaults that cost both sides heavily. Tanks unsuited to mountain jungle were driven up tracks they had no right to navigate, firing directly into Japanese bunkers at ranges of 20 yards. Positions with no names on any map outside the battle orders were attacked, lost, retaken, and attacked again by men who had been in the field for weeks. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote in his diary in late May that he saw disaster staring him in the face in Assam. Slim read the same situation with a different confidence. He had watched the Japanese logistical position deteriorate with the patience of a man who has constructed a trap and is waiting for it to close. The enemy was still attacking, but it was attacking with less every week, against defenders who were growing stronger, and the monsoon that was killing Japanese supply routes was being absorbed by an Allied system built around aircraft rather than roads. All the while, 60 miles north, the man who had predicted from the beginning that the plan would fail was discovering that being right was about to cost him everything. By mid-May of 1944, Sato's 31st Division had been in the field for 9 weeks on supplies allocated for 3. The words starvation and disease in the dispatches from his forward units were not metaphors. His men were eating wild yams and grass pulled from the jungle floor. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi had moved through the ranks with the efficiency of a second army. The pack horses and mules were dead. Men were carrying shells on their backs along trails that the monsoon had turned to ankle-deep mud. Sato had been warning his superiors for weeks. The warnings had been received and ignored. On the 13th of May, he signaled Mutaguchi directly. Because of the rain and starvation, there is no time. Decided this division, accompanying the sick and wounded, should move to a point where it can receive supplies. Mutaguchi's reply carries the tone of a man unreachable by evidence. It is very difficult to understand why your division should evacuate under the pretext of supply difficulties, forgetting its brilliant services. Maintain the present position for 10 days. A resolute will makes the gods give way. But a resolute will cannot fill an empty belly or reload an empty rifle. On the 25th of May, Sato sent his ultimatum. Unless his division received supplies by the 1st of June, he would withdraw. No supplies came. On the 31st of May, Sato ordered his men to leave Kohima. In the entire history of the Imperial Japanese Army, a divisional commander had never retreated without orders or permission from above. This was not merely military insubordination. In the culture of the institution Sato served, it was an act close to treason. He understood precisely what he was doing and did it anyway, because his men were dying, and no signal from any headquarters was going to change what a starving soldier looks like. Mutaguchi's response arrived by radio. Retreat, and I will court-martial you. Sato replied with the words of a man who has already counted the cost and found it acceptable. Do what you please. I will bring you down with me. His final transmission before going radio silent. The tactical ability of Mutaguchi's staff lies below that of cadets. Then he switched off the radio and led his men east toward the Chindwin. The Japanese war correspondent Shizuo Maruyama watched what came out of the jungle on the far side. He wrote, "We had no ammunition, no clothes, no food, no guns. At Kohima, we were starved and then crushed." When Sato eventually reported to Army headquarters, he was presented with a short sword wrapped in white cloth, the traditional offer of seppuku. He refused it. He demanded a court-martial instead, a public legal proceeding in which everything would be placed on the record. Mutaguchi's promises, his failure to deliver supplies, the basis on which 85,000 soldiers had been sent into mountains with 3 weeks of food and ordered to conquer a subcontinent. The army could not allow this. A court-martial would make the truth a matter of official record, and the truth was inadmissible. Sato was declared mentally disturbed and forced into retirement on the 23rd of November, 1944. The man who had been right from the beginning was declared insane. The man who had been wrong was simply relieved of command. On the 22nd of June, 1944, the advance elements of the British force pushing south from Kohima met the advance elements of 4th Corps pushing north from Imphal at a road marker known as Milestone 109. The road was open. 110 days of siege were over. Of the 85,000 Japanese soldiers who had crossed the Chindwin in March, 53,000 were dead or missing by the end of July. The great majority did not die in combat. They died of starvation and disease and exhaustion on the retreat, collapsing on tracks too remote and too muddy to be reached by any help. The 14th Army's losses across both battlefields numbered 17,000. The Japanese had lost more than 3 times as many to an enemy they had expected to break at first contact. In December of 1944, Slim was knighted on the Imphal Plain, the same ground where he had stood in 1942, watching the remnants of Burma Corps file past him in defeat. The Viceroy, Lord Wavell, conducted the ceremony with Scottish, Gurkha, and Punjabi regiments standing on parade together on the earth they had just defended together. It was one of the most striking military ceremonies of the entire war. Almost no one in Britain read about it. The newspapers had been full of something else: the Normandy landings, the liberation of France. The press corps of the democratic world had gone to the beaches, and the 14th Army's victory in a jungle in Assam received, in most publications, a paragraph, sometimes two. This was not simply an oversight by editors with limited space. It reflected a policy established in December of 1941, when Britain and America formally agreed that the war against Germany was the priority and the war against Japan was the secondary theater. The 14th Army had always known this. They had fought their entire campaign with the resources that remained after Europe had been supplied. They had been told their war mattered less. They had won it anyway, and the verdict on its importance did not change when they did. Mutaguchi's prediction that Indian soldiers would mutiny, the entire political premise of Bose's march alongside the Japanese as liberators, was answered with complete decisiveness on the Imphal plain. Indian soldiers of the 14th Army fought with distinguished courage throughout the campaign and beyond. The Army stayed loyal. The Indian National Army became a footnote. The vision of colonial collapse that had emboldened the offensive never materialized for a single hour. Churchill's role in the erasure went beyond ordinary neglect. He wrote the dominant history of the war, published to universal acclaim in 6 volumes, and the great victories of the Indian Army at Kohima and Imphal in 1944, at Meiktila and Mandalay in 1945, are largely absent from its pages. He did not merely fail to celebrate what had been achieved, he failed to record it. The buried truth of this particular story was not a classified document filed in a government basement. It was the memoir of the man most responsible for how the war was remembered, in which 500,000 soldiers and their extraordinary victory barely register. Those 500,000 were not primarily British. By the end of the campaign, only 13% of the 14th Army was ethnically British. The Army's foundation was the Indian Army, by 1945, the largest all-volunteer military force in history, 2.5 million strong. It included 3 African divisions, Gurkhas from Nepal, and tens of thousands of Burmese volunteers who had joined the fight for reasons more personal than any of the others, since they were fighting for the liberation of their own country. The forgetting of the 14th Army was not purely British indifference to a distant theater. It was, at least in part, a failure to reckon honestly with who had actually done the fighting and what acknowledging that would require. Among the Burmese volunteers was a man named Saw Joshua Yoshu, who had served in the Burma Rifles Regiment since 1934. When a British charity worker found him decades after the war, he was living in poverty. He had 1 set of clothes. He could not afford the medication for his asthma. He was 87 years old and could still recite his rank, serial number, and commanding officer's name without hesitation. When the charity worker asked what she could do for him, Yoshu made one request: that his officers be told he was still alive. His condition, the poverty, the illness, the 1 set of clothes, none of it was what he raised. He wanted his officers to know he was alive. The British government had nothing to tell them. On the slopes of Garrison Hill in Kohima, where the tennis court once stood, where men rolled grenades at each other across 15 meters of asphalt in the dark, where a millionaire's son walked alone into a machine gun bunker and came out carrying a trophy, where a battalion held 15 days against a division, there is a war cemetery maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. 1,420 graves arranged on terraces cut into the hillside. At the lower end, the memorial stone of the 2nd Division stands upright in the style used by the Naga people to mark their own dead. On the bronze plate set into its face, there is an inscription. It was written in 1918 for the dead of a different war by a Cambridge classicist named John Maxwell Edmonds, who spent the war years breaking codes in the War Office. It was adopted for Kohima in 1944 by a classical scholar in the 2nd Division who had memorized it imperfectly and whose imperfect version was kept, because some misrememberings are more true than the original, and because the words fit the men in the trench below with a precision that no correctly remembered version could have improved. In 2024, the Nagaland government unveiled a new Kohima Peace Memorial, funded by the Japan International Cooperation Agency. The Japanese ambassador was present for the ceremony. 8 decades after the army that had besieged that ridge starved and broke itself against 2,500 men who would not move, Japan built a monument. Britain had not recently done so. General Slim wrote, at the close of his memoir, the line that should have been the definitive verdict on the 14th Army from the moment the road opened at milestone 109. To the soldiers of the many races who, in the comradeship of the 14th Army, did go on, and to the airmen who flew with them and fought over them, belongs the true glory of achievement. It was they who turned defeat into victory. He wrote those words in retirement, in a country that had largely decided to look elsewhere. The tradesman's son from Birmingham had led the most diverse army in British history. British, Indian, African, Gurkha, Burmese, bound together by mutual respect and by a general who understood from the first day that leadership is a gift given by those who follow, to the greatest British land victory of the entire war. The victory was real. The army was real. The forgetting was a choice. The stone at Kohima carries 2 lines. They were written for a different war. A scholar misremembered them, and the misremembering held because the men in the ground below had earned them beyond any question of authorship. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. They gave their today. It took 80 years for Britain to begin, haltingly and incompletely, to say, now you know the story. Tell someone who does not.